All right, guys. So today we're going to be talking about limiting factors. What these are factors that kind of keep the population down. We talked about this last class as well. But populations can't grow without limit. All right. In most cases, this is going to be based on the resources available in that population. And those different things that keep the population from growing are called limiting factors. So we're going to explore what those things are so that you know what things would be limiting a population in general. Right? So, first and foremost, what is a limiting factor? A limiting factor is, like I said, anything that's going to stop or slow down a population's growth. Some examples of this could be food, could be the available mates in the area, and it could also be competition with other organisms that are either in your species or from another species that want the same resources as you. All right. Now, this doesn't have to be things that are alive. It's literally anything that is um, holding the population down. So this could be something that's not living, such as forest fires that are constant and frequent, or even things like human interference, such as pollution or industrialization. So all these things are limiting factors. They limit the size of the population. Now, each environment, depending on where you or where the species lives, has its own set of limiting factors. So an organism can be very successful in one environment, but then have a very small population in another due to changing limiting factors and how that species actually interacts with those factors. On the same side, each species in that environment has its own limiting factors and its own limits on growth because of that. So they have their own set of resources that they'll be able to accommodate. They'll have their own competition, their own set of mates, and their own set of problems that will then limit the size of their individual population. So not every population is limited to the same, and not every environment has the same limit. All right. So each limit and each species has their own set of limiting factors. Now, there are actually two different kinds of limiting factors. The first one is density dependent. Density dependent factors are factors that are based on the number of species that are available in the population. So, the more individuals you have in the area, the more that these factors are going to affect the population size. Some examples of density dependent factors would be predation, competition, disease, and parasitism. So the more organisms that are in an area, you can imagine the number of resources are going to stay the same. The amount of food is going to stay the same. The amount of water is going to stay the same. The amount of space to live in is all going to stay the same. And so every individual in that population is going to be competing for that space and that food, those resources. And so that is competition, where you're competing for resources. You're fighting for resources with other organisms. Obviously, those who are unsuccessful in getting that space are going to die, and so that's why it's going to bring the population down. That competition, predation. The more organisms that are alive, the more likely the predator population will rise as well, which will help to bring the population back down. So, the larger the population, predation becomes a bigger factor because you have more organisms that will be able to eat you, basically. And then disease is a very obvious one, where the more organisms in an area, the more waste is produced, and waste brings the possibility for disease. And so, the greater the population size, the more likely there is to be a disease that starts to wipe out a lot of people. Or, sorry, not people, but organisms. So, a great example of this would be COVID. That's what I was thinking about people. So, the larger number of people in the population, you got COVID-19, this disease that wipes out quite a few, right? So the greater the population size, the more likely there is going to be a disease that starts to bring the population down, right? So all of these are based on the total number of individuals in a population. The greater the population size, the more density dependent factors will start to impact that population. The smaller the size, the less that these will start to impact the population. And again, these are all dependent on population size, and it'll be different for every environment. So keep that in mind. Now, on the other hand, we have density independent, which means these factors will affect the population. Uh, it doesn't matter if there is a certain, like a small population or a large population, these will exist and these will still kill off some members. Um, these are usually going to be abiotic or non living factors. And these could be stuff like the amount of space available, the conditions of the soil for plants, not really for animals, but the amount of water, the conditions of the water. Is the water sanitary? Uh, Natural disasters like hurricanes or floods, those things can kill off a lot of organisms. And it didn't matter if it was a small population or if it was a large population, those things will happen, right? We know that droughts randomly occur where the water will just decrease. And it didn't happen because there were a lot of organisms in that area, it happened because the weather changed and it killed off a lot of organisms. Those are density independent. They do not change due to the number of population. They just happen. All right. So these are usually going to be abiotic limiters. The other ones tend to be biotic, which would be other organisms. These tend to be stuff in the environment that are actually changing. So those are actually your two right there. So we have limiting factors, generally going to be thought of as factors or variables that like restrict the growth or the size of a population um, in an ecosystem. And these factors will be present in whatever capacity, but what their job is to ensure that organisms are competing, which will then allow for the strongest organisms to survive and continue to reproduce, and the weakest organisms to die off. That is basically the key to limiting factors, and we'll talk about this in a later episode as to why organisms need this pressure in order to make sure that they are being successful. All right. I hope you guys enjoyed. Make sure you take notes. Later.